Patty Stalker, the Interim Executive Director at Cape Media Center, and I'm here with State Senator Julian Cyr for a legislative update. Welcome, Julian.
Hi, Patty. Welcome to the Cape. I mean, you've been here for quite some time, but welcome, and it's good to connect and be here with you.
Yeah. But I'm not here to talk about me. Let's talk about you, okay? So I may be new to the Cape, but you are not,
no,
right?
No.
So I like to open with people's backgrounds, and since I'm new to the Cape, and I'm sure there's plenty of our viewers that don't know, about Senator Julian Cyr. So you grew up on the Cape?
I did. I grew up in Truro. I think as longtime viewers will know, but we have had a lot of people. I mean, this is a place that people move to, come to retire to. We saw in COVID actually. The state Senate district that I represent actually had the second largest population increase after a district in Boston. So this is a place where we're in the business of welcoming people, whether it be for a week or for the rest of their lives. But so I grew up, born and raised in Truro. Went through the Nauset Public Schools. My family had a restaurant in Truro, a seasonal eatery called Adrian's Restaurant.
Oh, nice.
For 28 years. So spent more years of my life waiting on tables and working behind the line and dealing with demanding customers in July and August, sort of was bit by the organizing and advocacy bug way back when I was in high school. In Nauset, we had a pretty significant budget gap, and if we didn't pass a Proposition 2.5 override, the school district was going to have to lay off, a dozen or two staff, probably including the music program, my choir teacher, and got involved in convincing the voters of the Nauset towns to pass an override. And really, I think I've been riffing on that theme of stepping out and engaging in my community since. Had the good fortune to work for Governor Deval Patrick. Continued into Governor Baker's administration, doing public health work as a public health policy guy. And then in 2016, the state Senate seat opened up, and I actually was thinking, I probably should go to grad school, but I was a little lazy on taking the standardized tests. You have to get into those, and so I sort of said, hey, well, maybe I'll run for state Senate. Not expecting, I was a 29-year-old candidate, first-time candidate from the smallest town on Cape Cod. My family isn't, isn't terribly political.
You're not connected, right?
Connected in that way, but worked really hard, but also got really lucky, and won a competitive primary, won a competitive general election. Have had actually competitive races. We're up every 2 years in Massachusetts in the legislature, entire Senate and the House. Have always had a competitive race, except in 2020 during the height of COVID, and have really been grateful to be elected to and then sent back to Beacon Hill by the voters of Cape Cod and the islands.
Nice.
The district includes most all of Cape Cod, as well as Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And in the Senate, I've primarily had a leadership role first on a lot of healthcare and healthcare issues. I chaired the Joint Committee on Mental Health and Substance Use and Recovery, was the lead author in the Senate of the Mental Health ABC Act, which was nation-leading healthcare mental health parity reform, a lot of substance use work. Then chaired the Public Health Committee, working on a whole myriad of issues. Long-time viewers will know the good work we did here in Barnstable County, particularly around COVID. And then actually this session, the Senate President appointed me to chair the Joint Committee on Housing. Housing's the really biggest challenge we're facing here in the Commonwealth, most immediately. And certainly nowhere is that problem more acute than in my district on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. So tackling that issue. And I also been fortunate to be appointed to leadership on the Assistant Majority Whip. So basically that means I'm the millennial at the leadership table in the Senate, getting to make sure that Cape Codders and Islanders have a say and the needs and interests of this very unique region are taken into account, right? Trying to make the case every day, right? It's not just, look, all my colleagues certainly know and love this place and what this place is in July and August,
right? But
really explaining the challenges we have being a geographically isolated area, incomes below the state average. We've got the oldest population here on Cape Cod, anywhere in New England.
Right.
So look, this is a incredibly special, unique, beautiful place, but we've got big challenges, and
certainly
been trying to sink my teeth into those ever since 2017, and really really ever since, much earlier than that too. So
You touched on several of the things that I think, I mean, I just moved here in April, but I've been coming down here my whole life. I had a second home here, in West Yarmouth. I live in West Yarmouth now, and I lived down here in the '90s. I was here during Hurricane Bob.
I remember Hurricane.
Yeah, right. But you
fun
were probably like a baby then, right?
I was like, no, I was like 4 or 5, maybe 6. No, I remember actually, for some reason, my parents' restaurant didn't lose, or the power came back on soonest.
Wow, all right.
And the Outer Cape was devastated in Hurricane Bob, but they were open, and they served a lot of pizzas.
I was living in the west end of Hyannis, and I was like cooking out on a hibachi in my backyard for like a week.
See, I thought it was really fun because all these trees had fallen in my parents' yard, and so it
was
felt
fun.
like a playground.
I think that sort of going back to your roots or whatever, just having to be living with no lights on and that sort of thing, But no, but you touched on some of the challenges of Cape Cod, and it was kind of where I was going. As having lived off Cape most of my life, but always coming down here throughout my life, and it certainly is isolated, and it certainly, has an aging population, and the seasonal, employment and people struggling to find affordable housing, and the coastal resiliency issues that Cape has, and that's why I brought up like Hurricane Bob, right? But as climate change is becoming more evident, all these things are sort of impacting the Cape. And what do you think right now is the biggest challenge here on the Cape? Do you think it's affordable housing?
So the biggest and most acute challenge that we've got right now is housing, and a housing crisis, that we've had here for 20 years since I was in high school. The COVID-19 pandemic put that problem on steroids.
But how so?
Well, so median home price across my district has more than doubled since I became state senator. Median home price in Barnstable County is now north of $700,000. It's far more than that if you come to, my neck of the woods in Provincetown or Truro. You look at Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, where median home prices are in the millions of dollars. And so the reality is, if you are a year-round Cape Codder, even if you're making a really good salary here, you just can't afford to get into this real estate market. We see that. We see about 100. We see that we're losing about 1,000 families a year who make good money, who are leaving Cape Cod because they can't afford to live here. Each and every day, we think about 30% of our workforce is commuting over those aging bridges.
Well, I'm also hearing being out in the community and people that grow up here, right? Someone that's lived here their whole lives, 18-year-olds or 19, 20-something-year-olds who graduates from college. And I hear this common complaint, I want to live here and I can't find a job and I can't afford to stay on the Cape. So I think this is kind of what you're addressing right now.
Well, the people I know my age or even younger, if you're here, you're here because, we're here because our families have a foothold here, right? There's no way I could have, moved to Truro or Provincetown and had the job I had or any sort of job, right? And I think that's fun. There's been a fundamental shift. Just this last weekend, actually, we celebrated my dad's 70th birthday.
Nice. And
he first came here. My parents grew up in suburban Connecticut, and he moved to Provincetown in September 1974 at 18. And he got a job dishwashing at the Red Inn. He worked there for 11 years. They were able to, buy a house, have a family, start a business. That was not a unique, special story. That was actually quite commonplace, right? Either you're born here, you wash ashore here, you're able to make a life. There's busier seasons, there's slower seasons, but you also have to cobble it together and can really have, a strong community and a good life here. And that all is, fundamentally changed. And so now, I go talk to business leaders, folks running our towns, fire chiefs, police departments, superintendents. The number one issue they talk about, right? They can't recruit or retain workforce because no one can afford a place to live. And so what the region's going to have to do, and there's several challenges we're facing, right? With wastewater infrastructure, rising seas and a changing climate, certainly infrastructure with the Cape bridges. But on housing, we're going to have to figure out a way not just to subsidize housing for people of low income who qualify for traditional affordable housing programs. Those are crucial and we have to keep doing them. But we're going to have to figure out a way of how we subsidize housing, ultimately for most year-round working people who don't yet own a home or going to inherit a home. I mean, that's what the conversation is on Nantucket. That's a conversation in Provincetown. And, and I sort of have the good fortune to, represent most of the region, right? So you can see, you can see how this trend, you can actually track the trend, right? Where real estate prices are today on Nantucket, they'll be on Martha's Vineyard in about 4 or 5 years. They'll probably be in Provincetown in, another 2 or 3 years after that, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a trend that's sort of coming. But even before we could tackle housing, we had to tackle wastewater. And this is something where, after many, many, many years, we're really seeing some significant progress. Here in Dennis, just was at a groundbreaking last week. Dennis is moving forward with a very substantial project to sewer the town. It's taken years to get here. Really proud that we brought significant dollars. About half this project is being paid for with state or region-wide support. $50 million of this project is coming from something called the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund.
Sure.
This is a fund that I was the lead author on, along with former State Representative Sarah Peake. But the whole Cape and Islands delegation at the time in 2018 was in on this. Timmy Whalen, the rest of the delegation, in a bipartisan fashion.
When was this?
So
what year was this?
This was in 2018. When the legislature extended room occupancy tax to short-term rentals, which our communities have been clamoring for years. What we said is, okay, look, we've got to come up with a funding stream for wastewater, right? Cape Cod at the time faced a $4 billion problem. We now think it's several billion more than that because of inflation. Fundamentally, our towns opted to forego federal funds to sewer when the federal government was basically paying for 90% of sewer projects in the 70s and into the 80s.
In the 70s, because 1972 wasn't that the Clean
Water
Act?
Yep.
I was talking to Ryan Chase, who's the assistant superintendent of the DPW in Yarmouth. And he was kind of, because I went over there to talk to him about what was going on. I was thinking of doing a story on the wastewater project that they're doing in Yarmouth as well. And so he was kind of talking about exactly what you're saying now, like back in 1972, and then it just kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed, and there was opportunities for funding, and now all of a sudden the Cape is looking at a crisis, right?
So the Cape had a crisis, even sort of a decade or more ago.
Right.
There was a lawsuit actually brought. And what the region did, I think, is really came together with our legislative delegation and really figured out, all right, how do we bring more money to this problem, right? If we just have to sewer on the backs of property taxpayers, this is going to be unaffordable. We're not going to be able to do it.
Right.
And so the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund takes a 2.75% surcharge on all rooms, hotels, motels, Airbnbs. It puts it into a dedicated shared pot of resources that then is distributed across the region. And that has meant tremendous savings for property taxpayers in Dennis and Yarmouth, across the region. Dennis alone, $50 million.
Wow.
I think Yarmouth is $34 million. Really significant. Basically, 25% of the cost of sewering is now being covered by the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund. And I think it's a really good model for, how when we work as a region, when we work collectively, when we try to figure out how do we, in this case, get other people's money, right, to help help sort of pay for this problem, we can make some really good progress. This is cleaning up our environment, especially, our marine estuaries and embayments. People are coming here because of our alleged pristine environment. It's not so pristine. But also, right, wastewater infrastructure and sewer is going to allow us to build a little more densely in our existing downtowns and villages so that we can then have the year-round housing we need to sustain ourselves from a year-round, perspective. So wastewater, big challenge, but very much, not mission accomplished, but very much underway. And now the work that we're tackling now is figuring out, all right, how do we now tackle this housing crisis that is only going to get worse?
How do we?
How are we doing it? Sure. So Governor Healy signed into law something called the Affordable Homes Act last summer. It's a $5.1 billion investment in housing. Includes a whole host of really important kind of policies and funding streams. Was just at Forward at the Rock actually early this morning for a little event. That project, funded in part through the supportive housing dollars that the state brings. But one of the policies contained in there is something called a seasonal communities designation. So viewers who follow statewide policy may be familiar with the gateway cities model. Gateway cities are cities across Massachusetts who are struggling economically, who need a little assistance. Hyannis is considered a gateway city. So we said, hey, how do we create a policy framework for towns like Dennis and Truro and Chilmark and Nantucket who have this seasonal population swing, who have this seasonal economy, whose real estate market has a set of unique factors. And so we came up with this seasonal communities designation that gives towns on Cape Cod and on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, as well as some towns in the Berkshires, unique tools that they can bring for housing policy. The ability to subsidize attainable housing, basically housing above area median income. The ability to purchase and retain year-round deed restrictions, basically saying, how do we make sure that a given parcel or a given property or project will be occupied year-round and not rented on a short-term basis.
Right, like a winter rental or something.
Exactly. Or often a summer rental, right?
Yeah.
That's the ones that get pricey.
I know, but I guess the people I know are always looking for winter rent. They're
probably
complaining
doing the
about,
shuffle, right?
they're doing the shuffle.
Maybe they're staying in the campground and then and there's several other tools that are sort of brought in seasonal communities. So that was included in the Affordable Homes Act. We're now, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities has issued draft regulations to implement this. And so this is sort of a big deal.
Right.
And we modeled the policy. We looked and we said, all right, who else is sort of confronting this issue, right? And it's other seasonal destinations, right? Places like the Hamptons, places like the Colorado ski towns, Aspen and Vail.
Yeah.
What Vail, Colorado has done, right, is they've taken these deed restrictions these year-round deed restrictions that we can now do here in Massachusetts, and it's used those to create middle market housing. So in Vail, Colorado, now about 30% of the housing are under year-round deed restrictions. They're middle market housing. They're more affordable for locals.
Right.
That is tremendously expensive to do. And how Vail and some other communities have paid for this is they pay for this via a transfer fee or a transfer tax on luxury real estate transactions. Yep. And so now that we have the seasonal communities, we have the policy, now we have to come up with the revenue source to fund this.
Right, exactly.
And to fund the level of housing we're going to have to, have here to sustain this place year round. Certainly, in places like Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and the Outer Cape, but also here on the Mid Cape. And so now we've got the policy toolkit. We're trying to come up with some sort of stable revenue and funding, whether it's a transfer fee, whether that's other sort of sources that we can then bring to bear on this big challenge.
So we were talking earlier, and I was saying there's several different. There's the statewide transfer fee on luxury properties, like you spoke about, the seasonal community transfer fee. There's the Martha's Vineyard Housing Bank, and then there's some Outer Cape home rule petitions. So when I was preparing for this interview, and I said to myself, I want to know what I'm talking about here to the senator. I started pulling up all these different, opportunities to come up with the money, like you said. Do any of these sort of interact poorly with each other? Do they complement each other? Or are they completely different entities that don't connect at all?
So there's a number of sort of policy proposals, that are out there. Think of the bill as an idea, right? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to figure out how can we get some sort of transfer fee. The idea for transfer fees started actually on Nantucket, who filed a home rule petition. Now a number of other communities have followed suit to have a local option, transfer fee. Right. Nantucket, Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, Orleans, Chatham, Eastham. Don't forget Eastham. All 6 towns on Martha's Vineyard. Mm-hmm. That was not successful last session. Governor Healy actually supported the idea, but we weren't able to get it over the finish line in the legislature. And so now these other bills are trying to figure out, all right, how can we get this? If you're a seasonal community, can you have a local option transfer fee? If you're in a certain county or region, like the island of Martha's Vineyard, can they have a housing bank, right? So these are all just sort of different policies trying to figure out, essentially, how can we bring the dollars that we're going to need to bear on housing. The reality is this is a very expensive problem. On Nantucket alone, we estimate the cost to the cost to sustain a year-round community for housing is probably about $500 million.
Wow.
Look, I love to bring home the bacon, but I don't think my colleagues on Beacon Hill want Massachusetts to be paying for that problem.
Right.
So the idea simply is like, look, when over 80% of the real estate transactions that you have in our communities are, these are second, third homes, investor properties, particularly over a certain price tag, they can be paying a little extra. This is not a novel policy, actually. Transfer fees exist in red states and blue states, in all sorts of cities. We're sort of late to the game here in Massachusetts. But the idea of these various bills is saying, all right, to my colleagues, basically like, we're open to how we get there. Help us get there. I think an idea that's increasingly gaining traction and I'm intrigued by is, again, how do we do this regionally? Think back to wastewater. The costs, if you're a given town, trying to purchase a year-round deed restriction or subsidize housing for your municipal workers, which is another important provision in seasonal communities, the administrative cost of that gets pricey, gets expensive. Can we pool resources in an equitable way? I think there's some conversation now about that. But all of this, to say is, we've gone a long way from a policy perspective with seasonal communities. It's a big deal. It's the biggest thing we've done since the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund. And now the challenge is, all right, how do we pay for this? And all those bills are just different ideas in how we pay for it.
That's pretty much what I was figured it out as I was going through it, but I kind of wanted you to explain it to the viewers, because people. What is the biggest pushback that you're hearing on this? Because I know what I'm seeing or hearing from people. And what is the biggest pushback on this this legislation?
The primary pushback is just in the real estate industry, who typically sort of don't support transfer fees.
Sure.
But the reality is that this is a policy that the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce is supporting, that so many of our employers and municipalities are supporting. So really, you're hearing the community really singing from the same songbook, asking for this. Actually, I know a number of realtors, especially on Nantucket at Martha's Vineyard, they're actually the loudest voices asking for this transfer fee. So really, we have a great playbook when Cape Codders and Islanders, are really all sort of saying the same thing. We're able to make that case on Beacon Hill, and it's my job, working with my colleagues in this delegation, to make the case, to make sure that we can get an audience with the right folks, and to move these issues as we've been doing since I was elected.
So what else is coming up, Senator?
So we got a lot going on. The Massachusetts Senate just passed nation-leading data privacy legislation. This is a big deal. Data privacy, right? All the information on your phone,
on your
computer, on your internet. This is sort of scary stuff. And what we did is we looked at various states who've passed laws before, and we came up with a sort of a best-in-the-nation law. We're hoping the House is going to take that up.
Nice.
Another big piece on our agenda is coastal resilience. Governor Healy filed an environmental bond bill that has a number of really crucial provisions on how we can prepare, particularly as coastal communities, to a changing climate. The idea of having coastal resilience districts that are able to plan across towns, for a whole host of various needs. How do you figure out where do you harden, where do you have to retreat? Another big issue within coastal resilience is insurance, homeowners insurance. Many Cape Codders and Islanders are facing really mounting insurance bills.
Right.
One of the challenges we have in the state is we don't have a robust flood insurance market, right? So if you have to purchase flood insurance, you really don't have many places to turn. So we're trying to figure that piece out. There's a number of other kind of policies that fall into that: ocean acidification, and of course making sure that the significant state dollars we've brought for wastewater, that those can be sustained into the next decade. So that's on the horizon. And then also, I think figuring out what's an increasingly very uncertain fiscal market. This current budget, the FY26 budget that we're in right now, we now estimate that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is going to lose about $600 million just from that recent federal law that was signed into law, right? And that's even before the very significant cuts to Medicaid. We've been very fiscally prudent, and actually in this budget, we set aside about $800 million in anticipation of a big cut in federal resources. But these ongoing cuts, that are being done in a very sort of arbitrary manner, we already worry are going to mean pain for Cape Codders, for Islanders, for people across Massachusetts, and with more to come. So a lot of uncertainty right now on the horizon, but we're just trying to work hard and stay focused on the things we can control and trying to make a lot of progress on them.
What are you hearing from some of the older population here on the Cape with all the cuts to federal funding, and now the government shut down, and how are you appeasing sort of the fear, I'm sure, that a lot of our older folks are feeling?
I mean, I hear a lot of folks that are anxious across the age spectrum. If anything, I hear from a lot of younger people who are really worried that this country's sort of walking away from a commitment to tackling the climate crisis. So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of hand wringing. I mean, I really just stay focused on the problems that we can control here. Sure. And look, we face some big problems on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket that don't have anything to do with the federal government. Our housing crisis, this is something that we created here in Massachusetts. This has nothing to do with federal housing policy. If you look at the states who actually are in the worst housing crisis, it's actually blue states and blue cities that have the worst crisis in the country. So I'm just trying to stay focused there, and that's what my job is.
Yes.
And try to bring optimism and representing Cape Codders and Islanders, on Beacon Hill, and just trying to keep doing that, and trying not to get distracted by each and every chaotic and competent moment that's coming out of Washington, D.C. I think actually a lot of those moments are intended to derail or distort or to make us feel sort of unmoored. And I'm really staying focused on the job I have here, and just making sure I'm connecting with people and working hard to represent the people who make a life right here on Cape Cod and the islands.
Well, it sounds like you're doing your job.
I'm trying to.
I mean, all these things that you mentioned, affordable housing and coastal resilience. I mean, those are things obviously that are very important. I mean, not just affordable housing, but housing in general, right? For housing for people on Cape Cod. Just one quick thing.
Sure.
Now, community television, and there's a bill out there to begin taxing some of these streaming companies that make over $250,000 a year, and we will get a portion of that. And what are your thoughts on community television? We could just wrap it up with that, if you don't mind.
Community television. I mean, look, this is a real sort of essential, news and community source, especially now as we've seen local news really erode. I feel really lucky to represent a district where we've got robust local press, especially on the Outer Cape, the Lower Cape, on the islands. In the Mid Cape, that's eroded a bit, right? And so local access is even sort of more critical. The way that local access has been funded traditionally has been through, I think going through cable or television, but that's not how people are tuning in these days, right?
Right.
Everyone's sort of streaming through the internet. And so basically the idea is a bill that basically modernizes and sort of keeps pace with how people are accessing television. It's something I support, actually. The Senate, I believe we passed this last session. So something we've got to come back to, get our friends in the House on board with, and hopefully work to support the good work y'all are doing. I think local media, whether it's here in community TV or a paper or some sort of entity, right? They really are arbiters of public discourse. And I think I can really see here on the Mid Cape where we have had a vacuum, a news desert. I see the difference because I represent places that have like the Chronicle or the Providence and Independent or the two island papers we have in Martha's Vineyard or the Inky Mirror on Nantucket, right? And I see the difference.
Yeah.
So what you folks are trying to do here is urgently needed, especially on the Mid Cape. So.
Thank you.
Thanks for
I
doing
appreciate it. I appreciate your support, and I appreciate you coming in today.
I'm delighted to be here.
Best of luck with all that you're doing here, and you're doing a great job. State Senator Julian Cyr with legislative update, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Looking forward to being back.
All right,
Thank you.
take care.